Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Tuesday? Guy in Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck, Belle in Texas, Bella in Florida. Sorry, just hearing Interesting. Computer's a little bit fanning loud. Guy in Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck, Belle in Texas, Bella in Florida, Lucy in Minnesota, Renee in Indiana, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandor in the Bronx, Karen in Northern California, Bill in mid-Missouri, and is that possible? That can't be. Hold on a second. Well, there they are. Moshe in Brooklyn, Haim in Florida, Lester in Florida, Frank in San Pedro, Aoife in Florida, Marie in Freeport. See, I knew you guys were there. If it wasn't showing up in my feed, the computer's wrong, not the students. I trust you guys. Joseph in Nevada. Welcome, everybody. Okay. Our dafs today, double daf, 51 and 52, pages 51 and 52 here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in chapter 5, picking it up pretty close to the top of page 51a. And we've been talking about if you learn out a law with respect to if you learn with respect to a sin offering, that you're going to slaughter it in a certain place because that's where the burnt offering is slaughtered. And then there's some reason to link the sin offering with the guilt offering. So can you then extend? It didn't say in the Torah that the sin offering is slaughtered in that place. We learned that through a linkage to the burnt offering. Can you then make a further linkage, like a secondary linkage, to the law of the guilt offering and say it's going to be slaughtered in the same place? And so we've been seeing that it depends on the kind of linkage you're making, right? So juxtaposition, if we learn out about the sin offering, for example, that it's slaughtered in a certain place because the law of the sin offering is juxtaposed in the Torah with the law of the burnt offering, and then the law of the guilt offering is juxtaposed to the law of the sin offering. Well, we cannot extend an element of the law of a certain offering from juxtaposition and another juxtaposition, right? Something that you learn by juxtaposition cannot be then extended to yet another verse by juxtaposition. That doesn't work. But when you're talking about a verbal analogy, maybe you can extend something that you learn from something that you learn about B from A through a verbal analogy, a gezeirah shavah. You then could extend by another verbal analogy from B to C, right? And so there's different combinations because there's linkages that could be through juxtaposition, through verbal analogy, through vachomer inference, sometimes translated as a fortiori inference. And also what we called yesterday in the Koran translation, a paradigm, right? A binyan av. And that's basically a rule that if you learn about, this aspect of offerings generally, that this is a rule, right? So that's a binyan av that you could then extend, to any verse where that same matter applies. You should be able to extend that aspect of the law. But if you learn, but it didn't mention it, right? So if you learn through the binyan av, through the general rule from A to B, then now you've established it for B, but you're linking from B to C through a different kind of linkage, a gezeirah shavah or a vachomer type of linkage. Since the first was learned from binyan av, can you then extend through vachomer to the next level? These were the kinds of questions we were asking yesterday and are continuing now. Okay, the Gemara asks, what is the law as to whether a matter derived via a binyan av, right, a general rule, can teach its law to another matter via a juxtaposition, or via a gezeirah shavah, verbal analogy, or the vachomer inference, or via another binyan of. So the Gemara states, well, resolve at least one of those questions. The Gemara cites a lengthy baraisa before stating the resolution that is inferred from that baraisa, right? So now we're going to list a long baraisa, and then we'll see how it proves or answers one of the questions, whether binyan of can then be a law learned by binyan of can then be extended to yet another verse through one of these other types of linkage. So here's this long baraisa that we're going to learn, that we're going to get an answer, that we're going to use to derive an answer to our question. So resolve at least one of those questions from a baraisa. Here's the baraisa. For what reason did the sages say that in the case of blood left overnight, it is fit? Meaning, if blood of an offering had been left overnight and was then placed on the altar, it need not be removed, right? It shouldn't have been placed on the altar. The fact that it was left overnight means it should not then have been placed on the altar the next day. But if it is placed on the altar, we don't take it down, right? Generally, in matters of holiness, we only ascend, we do not descend. So even though it shouldn't have been placed upon the altar, now that it's there, we don't take it off. We've seen there's a few exceptions to that, but generally speaking, that's true, even with respect to blood that was left overnight and therefore should not have been placed on the altar. How do we know that we don't take it off once it was put there? And this is as it is in the case of sacrificial portions, where if they are left overnight, they are fit. And from where is it derived? In the case of sacrificial portions, which are left overnight, they are fit. Well, this is as it is in the case of meat, where if it is left overnight, it is fit, because the meat of peace offerings may be eaten for 2 days and 1 night, right? Whereas the sin offering, the part of it that is eaten which is eaten only by priests, you only have 1 day and a night. You can eat it that day and that night, but if it's still left over the next morning, can no longer be eaten. Contrasted with peace offering, where you have today, tonight, and all the next day, the daytime, in order to eat the part of a peace offering that is eaten. That's eaten by its owner and his guests, let's say. That's not limited only to priests. But there's a difference, right? Peace offerings, you have 2 days and a night. Sin offerings and other kinds of offerings, you don't. Same with the Passover, right? The Passover has to be eaten that night. Anything that is left over the next morning, no good. You can't eat it anymore. So different kinds of offerings have different time limits. So how are we learning that? So you shouldn't have left it overnight, but if you did, right, it remains fit, right, after the fact, and we're learning that out from the peace offering. This is derived from the fact that if an offering, this is as it is in the case of meat, where if it is left overnight, it is fit, because the meat of a peace offering may be eaten for 2 days and 1 night. Now, from where is it derived that if an offering has left the temple courtyard and then it is placed on the altar, it need not be removed? Again, the fact that it left the temple courtyard disqualifies it. You should not put it up on the altar. But if you did, you need not remove it. How do we know that? This is derived by a binyan of. Since an offering that leaves its area is fit in the case of an offering brought on a private altar. Private altar? What's a private altar? We don't have private altars, but there were brief periods in Jewish history when there were private altars, like we're reading about in the parts of the Torah that we're reading right now. Abraham built an altar, Isaac built an altar, Jacob built an altar. Right, because that was before there was a tabernacle and an altar that the Torah God instructed Moses to teach the children of Israel to build the national altar. And then even after it was built, there were a couple times, short instances in Jewish history, when private altars were allowed, like during the conquest, when the Mishkan, the tabernacle, wasn't accessible to everybody. There were just a couple of short periods where there was a private altar, and it was possible to do this on private altars. And there was a law for those periods in history. Interestingly, that after the temple was destroyed, we did not go back, right? When the second temple was destroyed, we did not go back to the law of private altars. Why not? That's a matter for another day. Okay. So even though it has left the temple courtyard and should not be placed on the altar, if it did, we don't remove it. Why? Because this is like offerings that were offered on private altars during those brief periods in history. From where is it derived that if an offering that has become ritually impure, right, tameh, is placed on the altar, it need not be removed? This is derived by a binyan. Since one is permitted to offer an impure offering in the case of communal rites, i.e. communal offerings, right, when a majority of the nation or a majority of the priests are tameh, then we still can bring the communal offerings. So even in a state of impurity, that's permitted under those circumstances. And since there exist circumstances when an offering can be placed on the altar even though it was tameh, we will, now that something was placed on the altar that shouldn't have been because it was tameh, we'll let it stay. We won't take it off, even though we shouldn't have put it on in the first place. From where is it derived that in the case of an offering that was disqualified due to the intention of the priest who slaughtered it to consume it beyond its designated time? We spent a lot of time on that. That's pigul, right? If at the time of slaughter the priest was thinking that I'm slaughtering a sin offering and I'm going to eat the meat of it tomorrow, okay, that's beyond its designated time. Because he had that intention at the time of slaughter, that offering is already disqualified. That's the concept of pigul. If it was placed on the altar, it need not be removed. Again, it was rendered pigul. That meat should not have been placed on the altar along with the other sacrificial portions of a sin offering that are placed on the altar. But if you did place it on the altar, how do we know that you don't remove it? This law applies there since the sprinkling of its blood, from where is it derived? In the case of an offering that was disqualified due to pigul, if it was placed on the altar, it need not be removed. The law applies there since the sprinkling of its blood affects acceptance of the offering, notwithstanding its status of pigul. The status of pigul takes effect only if the sacrificial rites involving that offering were otherwise performed properly. This indicates that it still has the status of an offering, so it need not be removed from the altar. From where is it derived that in the case of an offering that was disqualified due to the intention of the priest who slaughtered it to consume it outside its designated area, that's not pigul, but it's still disqualified. Pigul means that in addition to being disqualified, if someone then later did eat of it anyway, intentionally, he'd be subject to chorus. If the priest had it in mind to eat some of it outside its designated area, as opposed to beyond its designated time, he has disqualified it. But if somebody went ahead and ate it anyway, intentionally, he violated a prohibition, but he's not subject to chorus. Okay, the point being that if he disqualified it through this intention to eat it, be outside of its designated place, right? A priest is going to eat it outside of the temple courtyard, then that disqualifies it. But if you end up placing it on the altar anyway, how do we know that you don't remove it? This is derived by a binyan, since it is juxtaposed to an offering that was slaughtered with intent to consume it beyond its designated time. Since we don't remove from the altar something that was pigul and placed on the altar anyway, likewise, we don't remove something that was placed on the altar despite that it shouldn't have been because it was disqualified because of an intent to eat it outside of its place. From where is it derived that in the case of an offering for which priests who are disqualified, they're disqualified because they have a blemish, or it turned out that they're the son of a marriage of a priest and a divorced woman, which is not permitted, so a disqualified priest. From where is it derived that in the case of an offering for which priests who are disqualified collect and sprinkled its blood, that if it was placed on the altar anyway, it need not be removed? This is derived from the law of these priests who are generally disqualified because they are tameh, yet who are fit to perform the communal rites. As we said, even priests who are tameh can perform communal offerings during a time when the majority of the priests or the majority of the Jewish people are tameh. So generally they would be disqualified, but since they are nevertheless fit to perform communal offerings, when all the priests or the majority of the people are impure. So in any event, the law of the sacrificial portions was derived via a binyan of from the law of meat that was left overnight. And then the law of blood was derived by a binyan of from the law of the sacrificial portions. Therefore, that's why we read that whole baraisa. But the point is, evidently, a matter derived via a binyan of can teach its law to another matter via a binyan of. Now, the Gemara questions the derivations of the baraisa. But can one deduce the law of a matter that is not fit, i.e. sacrificial portions that are disqualified due to having been left overnight, from the law of a matter that is fit, i.e. the peace offering, where it is permitted to eat it for 2 days and 1 night? Right, the peace offering has a longer, a longer time period during which it can be eaten. Its deadline is after 2 days and 1 night, whereas sin offerings is just 1 day and 1 night. So how can we learn out the law about that pertains to this violating this deadline and leaving it on the altar anyway when the offerings in question have different deadlines? So similarly, how can the baraisa derive the law of meat that was removed from the temple courtyard from the law of a private altar, which has no sacred area surrounding it? And the Gemara answers, the Tana of that baraisa relied on the verse, quote, command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law of the burnt offering. It is that which goes up on its firewood upon the altar all night until the morning, and the fire of the altar shall thereby be kept burning, in Leviticus 6:2. And this verse comes to amplify, teaching that many types of disqualified offerings may be left upon the altar. The derivations written in the baraisa are mere supports for those laws that we actually seem to have an explicit verse for it. We're not deriving it through those linkages. We are using those as support for a law that actually appears in the Torah. New topic. The Mishna teaches with regard to the sin offerings whose blood is presented inside the sanctuary. Right? When is the blood presented inside the sanctuary? We're talking about the offerings of Yom Kippur, or the sin offering of a priest, an anointed priest, meaning a high priest who made a mistake when he was bringing an offering, or one that the Sanhedrin made a mistake and then the population relied on that error. So there are special sin offerings brought for that, where the blood is sprinkled inside the sanctuary, right? Inside the sanctuary, not on the external altar, which is over here, right? So offerings that are sprinkled inside is what we're talking about here. Right, the Mishnah teaches with regard, and that's how, remember, this chapter is where we're dealing with the technical requirements of the various kinds of offerings, and we're starting with the holiest offerings of all, the offerings of Yom Kippur, and these other ones that are sprinkled inside the sanctuary. And then in this chapter, next we'll go to sin offerings, and eventually guilt offerings, and then peace offerings. We're going to go in decreasing level of sanctity. Okay, so as to these sin offerings whose blood is presented inside the sanctuary, we ask, as to the remainder of the blood which is left after the sprinklings, right? We've learned already that if any of the sprinklings was not done properly or was omitted, then the sin offering, when we're talking about sin offerings that are sprinkled inside the sanctuary, if any of those sprinklings were done wrong or omitted, the offering's disqualified. It does not achieve atonement, not for the person, not for the people. Okay? After all those sprinklings have been done properly, right, there's blood remaining in the service vessel from which the sprinklings were taken. So what do we do with that remaining blood in the service vessel? As to the remainder of the blood which is left after the sprinklings, a priest would pour it onto the western base of the external altar. So if we think about up on the Temple Mount, right, as I've told you before, this is the back of the sanctuary, right? And this is the western wall. So when this stood on the Temple Mount, then down here, external retaining wall, this wall down here at the bottom of the mount, that's what we call the Western Wall today, all that's remaining of when the temple stood in Jerusalem. This is where Jews pray. Right? This is the western side of the Holy Temple, meaning this is the eastern side. So what they're telling you now is that when a priest emerges from the sanctuary, right, through this door here, what he first encounters is the western edge of the altar. Right? This is the altar, the external altar. This would be its western edge here, that meaning the first edge that he encounters when he leaves the sanctuary. And there's a base there. You can kind of see, right, that there's a base of the altar. The altar stands on a base, and that base, kind of like a little extension out, like a little rim or a frame around the bottom of the external altar, that's the base of the altar where the remainder of blood is poured. Right? So as to the remainder of the blood, which is left after the sprinklings that were done inside the sanctuary, a priest would pour it onto the western base of the external altar. But if he did not place the remainder of the blood on the western base, it does not disqualify the offering. Why? Because it's always the sprinkling of the blood that affects atonement. He did all the sprinklings properly inside the sanctuary. Now he has a job to do, and to do it properly, to dispose of the remaining blood on the base of the altar. But if he neglected to do that part of the sacrificial procedure, the sacrifice nevertheless has effected atonement for an individual or for the people, because it's the sprinklings that did that. So he has to pour that blood out on the base of the altar, but if for some reason that doesn't happen, the offering has nonetheless effected atonement. The Gemara asks, what is the reason that it must be poured out on the western base? And the Gemara answers, the verse states with regard to the bull offering of the high priest, quote, and the priest shall sprinkle the blood upon the corners of the altar of sweet incense, that's the inner altar, the incense altar inside the sanctuary, before the Lord, which is in the tent of meeting, and all the remaining blood of the bull he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. That's Leviticus 4:7. And this teaches that he must pour it out on that base which he encounters first when he leaves the tent of meeting. And the tent of meeting is the equivalent of the sanctuary, right? The temple was built by Solomon. It replaced the tabernacle in the desert. So when he emerges from the tent of meeting the Lord, it's like emerging from the sanctuary. The altar is right in front of him, and it's the base of the altar that is nearest to him on which he pours out that remaining blood. The sages taught in a baraisa, there are 3 verses that contain the same phrase. With regard to pouring the remainder of the blood of a bull offering of the high priest, remember the high priest on Yom Kippur, he brings he brings a bunch of offerings, but the most important ones are the goat of Yom Kippur and the bull of Yom Kippur. The goat of Yom Kippur, that's one of the pair of goats. One was sent out into the wilderness, one is slaughtered, and its blood is sprinkled inside the sanctuary. That goat atones for all the Jewish people. There's also a bull, right, much larger animal, but it atones for the high priest himself, his family, and his fellow priests. Okay, so with regard to the remainder of the blood of the bull offering of the high priest, the verse states, all the remaining blood of the bull he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering. And this teaches that it must be on the base of the external altar, not on the base of the inner altar where he sprinkled the blood. And that baraisa continues with regard to the bull sacrificed for an unwitting communal sin. The verse states, and he shall sprinkle the blood upon the corners of the altar, which is before the Lord, that is in the tent of meeting, right? That's the inner altar. And all the remaining blood shall he pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. This teaches that the inner altar itself has no base at all. Finally, the verse states with regard to the sin offering of a king, and the priest shall take of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and place it upon the corners of the altar of burnt offering, and the remaining blood thereof shall he pour out at the base of the altar of the burnt offering. And this teaches that you must give a base to the altar of the burnt offering, i.e. that the remainder of any blood placed on the altar must be poured on the base. And the Brisa continues, or perhaps it is not so. Maybe we're learning out the wrong lesson. But rather the verse serves to teach that any sprinkling of blood on the corners of the altar of the burnt offering will be done on a part of the altar where there is a base. Rabbi Yishmael said there is no need for the verse to teach that law because it can be derived via a kal vachomer inference, just as the remainder of the blood which does not effect atonement requires pouring on the base of the altar. With regard to the initial sprinkling of the blood of a burnt offering, which does effect atonement, it does effect, right, whatever the purpose of the offering is, it's affected by the sprinkling of the blood. Is it not logical that it requires a part of the altar where there is a base? And similarly, Rabbi Akiva said, just as the remainder of the blood, which does not effect atonement and does not come for atonement, nevertheless requires pouring on the base of the altar, with regard to the initial sprinkling of the blood of a burnt offering, which effects atonement and comes for atonement, is it not logical that it requires a part of the altar where there is a base? That's how we know where there's a base, where there's not a base, which part of the altar we need to sprinkle on, where there is a base, where we need to deposit the rest of the blood, etc. And the Brisa concludes, if so, why must the verse state at the base of the altar of burnt offering? Why is it repeated this third time? It is to teach you that you must give a base to the altar of the burnt offering, i.e. that the remainder of the blood of the burnt offering must be poured on the base. And the Gemara discusses this Brisa. The Master says, the verse states at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting in Leviticus 4:18. And this teaches that it must be on the base of the external altar, but not the base of the inner altar. And the Gemara asks, isn't that necessary for the matter itself, to teach that the remainder of the blood must be poured onto the base of the external altar? How are you learning out from that you also cannot have a base on the inner altar? And the Gemara answers, that law is derived from, quote, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting in Leviticus 4:18, referring to the external altar. Therefore, the verse mentions the altar of burnt offering to exclude the base of the inner altar. The Brisa teaches with regard to the sin offering of a king. The verse states, and the priest shall take of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and place it upon the corners of the altar of burnt offering, and the remaining blood thereof shall he pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering. That's Leviticus 4:25. And this teaches that you must give a base to the altar of the burnt offering, i.e. the remainder of any blood placed on the altar must be poured on the base. Right? And the concept here is base doesn't just mean where the bottom of the altar meets the ground. Rather, there has to be, an extra level, sort of like, I don't know, if this is my altar and it was resting on the ground, that would be no good. It would have to have a base. So the ground, the base, and then the altar, right? And so now that you have a base, when you pour out the remainder of the blood, it has to be poured out on the base, right? Not just where the altar meets the ground, but rather on the base, which is going to have a horizontal surface and a vertical surface, as we shall see. Must give a base to the altar of the burnt offering. Either the remainder of any blood placed on the altar must be poured on the base. We are on page 51b, and you're going to be amazed how fast we get through page 51b. The Gemara explains, because if it enters your mind that the verse states this simply to teach as it is written concerning this offering alone, why do I need these verses with regard to the sin offering of a king? We would have learned that already. So if you would answer, the verses are needed to teach the law that the remainder of the blood must be poured on the external altar rather than on the inner altar, then the question remains, is there any need for the Torah to teach this about the remainder? But the sprinklings of blood themselves are performed on the external altar, so why would one think that the remainder of the blood would be poured on the inner altar? And if you would say that one might mistakenly say that the priest reverses the sprinklings such that, and now we're on page 52a. 51b might be the shortest daf we've had ever. 52a. Such that with regard to an offering for which he sprinkles the blood on the external altar, he should pour the remainder of the blood on the inner altar. And this is analogous to the law that he pours the remainder of the blood sprinkled on the inner altar on the base of the external altar. Well, that's not possible. But the inner altar itself does not have a base, and therefore it is not possible to pour the remainder of the blood on the base of the inner altar. Now that we understand that base doesn't just mean where the vertical, wall of the inner altar meets the ground. A base is a base. You can only pour it out on the base, which is its own level. Therefore, the verse must teach that the remainder of the blood of the burnt offering is poured on the base of the external altar. Now, the Gemara analyzes the next clause of that baraisa, or perhaps it is not so, but rather the verse serves to teach that any sprinkling of blood on the corners of the altar of the burnt offering, will be done on a part of the altar where there is a base. And the Gemara asks, how can the verse mean that? Is it written at the base of the burnt offering? This would indicate that the blood of the burnt offering must be placed where there is a base. It is written in the verse at the base of the altar of burnt offering, right? We're not talking about an altar where burnt offerings are performed among other offerings. We're saying where offerings are burned. Right? That's where offerings are burned. So this is going to refer to any offerings that have parts that are burned on the altar. The burnt offering is entirely consumed on the altar of burnt offering. Other offerings have portions that are consumed on the altar of burnt offering. The Gemara answers, even if the verse were to be speaking about sprinkling the blood of the burnt offering, and it is not referring to pouring the remainder of the blood, then the term altar of is necessary, because if it were written at the base of the burnt offering, I would say that the priest must sprinkle the blood on the upright wall of the base of the altar, i.e. on the side of the base, rather than on the upper horizontal surface of the base. Now that it is written at the base of the altar of the burnt offering, it means that the blood must be sprinkled on the upper surface of the base, right? Again, altar, base, this is the upper surface, right? That horizontal surface that's at the top of the base, as opposed to the vertical surface on the side of the base, which is lower than the horizontal surface. The Gemara explains the next clause of the baraisa based on this understanding. Rabbi Yishmael said, why do I need a verse to teach that the blood must be sprinkled on the upper surface, the horizontal surface of the base of the altar? It can be derived via a kal vachomer inference, just as the remainder of the blood of a sin offering, which does not effect atonement, the remainder does not, right? The sprinkling of the blood of a sin offering does effect atonement. But just as the remainder of the blood of a sin offering, which does not effect atonement, nevertheless requires that it must be poured on the upper surface of the base of the altar, with regard to the initial sprinkling of the blood of a burnt offering, which effects atonement, or which fulfills the obligation of one bringing a burnt offering, is it not logical that it requires the upper surface of the base of the altar? And Rabbi Akiva explained similarly and said, just as the remainder of the blood of a sin offering, which does not effect atonement and does not come for atonement, nevertheless requires that it must be poured on the upper surface of the base, with regard to the initial sprinkling of the blood of a burnt offering, which does effect atonement and comes for atonement, is it not logical that it requires the upper surface of the base of the altar? And the Baraisa concludes, if so, why must the verse state at the base of the altar of burnt offering in Leviticus 4:25? It is to teach that you must give a base to the altar of the burnt offering, i.e. that the remainder of any blood sprinkled on the altar must be poured on the base. And where on the base? On the upper surface. The Gemara asks, what is the difference between the explanations of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva? Rav Ada bar Ahava says the difference between them is whether failure to pour the remainder of the blood disqualifies the offering, so that all the sprinklings must be done again. One sage, Rabbi Yishmael, holds that failure to pour the remainder of the blood does disqualify the offering. And one sage, Rabbi Akiva, who adds the words, which does not come for atonement, holds that failure to pour the remainder of the blood does not disqualify the offering, and the law follows Rabbi Akiva in this. Rav Papa says everyone agrees that failure to pour the remainder of the blood on the base does not disqualify the offering. But here they disagree with regard to the issue of whether failure to squeeze the blood from a bird sin offering after sprinkling the blood disqualifies the offering or not. One sage, Rabbi Yishmael, holds that it does disqualify the offering, and the other sage, Rabbi Akiva, holds that it does not disqualify the offering. Same ruling, essentially, but it's a little different, right? A little different because when we're talking about the blood of animal offerings, the animal was slaughtered, blood poured out. That's how the animal died. When the blood poured out, the blood of the soul, it was collected in a service vessel by a qualified priest who conveyed it to the altar, dipped his finger in there and sprinkled the blood. And then the remainder of the blood from that service vessel is poured out on the base of the altar. When a bird offering is brought, it is not shechted. It is not slaughtered, right? It is killed in a different way than having a blade cut its neck. Rather, its neck is pinched. It's still killed, but it's pinched by the thumbnail of a priest who knows how to conduct this particular ritual of killing birds for bird offerings, pigeons, by pinching the nape of the neck. And then, once the bird is dead and now bleeding, blood from the bird is then applied onto the corners of the altar where it needs to be applied, right? And then what are we talking about? Is going to go on the base, like blood that's still dripping out of the bird needs to go on the base. That's a little bit different than the remainder of the blood that's in a service vessel being poured out on the base, right? That's why it might have a different law. Seems to have the same law, but that's why it might be different. It is taught in a Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rav Papa that even Rabbi Yishmael agrees that failure to pour the remainder of the blood on the base does not disqualify the offering. The verse states, and the priest shall sprinkle the blood upon the corners of the altar of sweet incense before the Lord. Now we're talking about most sacred offerings, the most, right? Yom Kippur and these communal error offerings. That are sprinkled inside the sanctuary. That means that's where the inner altar, right, the incense altar is. Upon the corners of the altar of sweet incense before the Lord, which is inside the tent of meeting, and all the remaining blood of the bull, right, of Yom Kippur, he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. That's in Leviticus 4:7. So what is the meaning when the verse states of the bull? This seems superfluous, as the entire passage is referring to the bull. We know that it is of the bull. So therefore, by including the phrase of the bull, again, when it was unnecessary, the Torah teaches the law of another bull, i.e. the bull of Yom Kippur. We were talking about the bull of the communal sin offering for error, which also requires placement of the blood on the base of the external altar. This is the statement of Rebbe. The Baraisa continues, Rabbi Yishmael said it is not necessary for the Torah to write that the blood of the bull of Yom Kippur requires placement of blood on the base of the external altar. This is because it can be derived via vachomer inference. And just as if the bull of the anointed priest, i.e. the sin offering of the high priest, with regard to which it is not obligatory to bring its blood inside the sanctuary, i.e. it is not an obligatory offering, as he brings it only if he sins, nevertheless requires sprinkling blood on the base of the altar, then with regard to the bull of Yom Kippur, with regard to which it is obligatory to bring its blood inside the sanctuary, i.e. it must be brought every year, is it not logical that it requires sprinkling of its blood on the base of the altar? Right? Kal vachomer. Rabbi Akiva said, just as the bull of a high priest, with regard to which its blood does not enter the innermost sanctum, whether as a fixed obligation or as a mitzvah, nevertheless requires pouring of blood on the base of the altar, then concerning the bull of Yom Kippur, with regard to which its blood does enter the innermost sanctum as an obligation when he sprinkles it between the staves of the ark, which is inside the Holy of Holies, is it not logical that it also requires pouring of the blood on the base of the altar? And the Baraisa continues, one might have thought that the reason the Torah writes the phrase of the bull is to teach that failure to place the blood on the base of the external altar disqualifies the offering. Therefore, the verse states with regard to the service of Yom Kippur, after sprinkling the blood in the sanctuary, and when he has made an end of atoning for the sanctuary and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat. Right now we're back to Yom Kippur. This teaches that once he has sprinkled the blood in the innermost sanctum, all the atonements are completed. This is the statement of Rabbi Yishmael. The Brisa continues, from now, i.e. based on this, one can state a kal vachomer inference to derive the law of the bull of the anointed priest. Right, when an anointed priest makes an error in bringing offerings on the nation, he's got to bring this special bull that requires sprinkling inside the sanctuary, but not inside the Holy of Holies. So from here, one can state the kal vachomer inference to derive the law of the bull of the anointed priest from the law of the goat of the king. Just as the goat sin offering of a king, with regard to which its blood does not enter inside the sanctuary, it's just sprinkled on the outer altar, whether as a fixed obligation or as a mitzvah, but is sprinkled like other individual sin offerings on the external altar, requires that the blood be poured out on the base of the altar. Then, with regard to the sin offering of a high priest, the blood of which enters inside the sanctuary, whether as a fixed obligation or as a mitzvah, is it not logical that it should require pouring on the base of the altar? Right? Simple kal vachomer. So if with regard to a type of offering that has fewer stringencies and its remaining blood is poured on the base of the external altar, then with regard to another offering that has greater stringencies, all the more so we would expect that any blood remainder ends up getting poured on the base of the external altar. That's the kal vachomer they're saying. If so, the verse that states that there is a requirement that the blood of the sin offering of a high priest is poured on the base of the altar is apparently superfluous. Once we've learned out this principle that any of these offerings that have lesser stringencies, their remaining blood is poured out on the altar, well, why do we have to keep deriving that for every one of these offerings whose blood is sprinkled inside the sanctuary? One might have thought that the reason that the Torah writes it is to teach that failure to pour the blood there disqualifies the offering. Therefore, the verse states, and the priest shall sprinkle of the blood upon the corners of the altar of sweet incense before the Lord, which is in the tent of meeting, and all the remaining blood of the bull he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And the Bryce explains, since the verse inverted the terms in the clause, writing, and all the remaining blood of the bull he shall pour out, rather than saying he shall pour out all the remaining blood of the bull, the verse detaches this positive mitzvah of pouring the remaining blood from the other mitzvahs in the verse. And the verse thereby made this a non-essential mitzvah, non-essential commandment, to tell you that failure to pour the remainder of the blood on the base of the altar does not disqualify the offering. This Baraisa supports Rav Papa's interpretation that Rabbi Yishmael agrees that failure to pour the remainder of the blood on the base of the altar does not disqualify the offering. And the Gemara asks, but does Rabbi Yishmael hold that failure to squeeze out the blood of a bird sin offering disqualifies the offering, as Rav Papa explained? But the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, the verse states, and he shall sprinkle the blood of a sin offering upon the side of the altar, and the remainder of the blood shall be squeezed out at the base of the altar. Since we're saying squeezing out, we know we're talking about a bird sin offering. And that verse in Leviticus 5:9, again, let's read the whole thing. And he shall sprinkle the blood of this sin offering upon the side of the altar, and the remainder of the blood shall be squeezed out on the base of the altar. It is a sin offering. Leviticus 5:9. And this means, and the remainder shall be squeezed out, i.e., it needs to be squeezed out only if some blood remains. And that which does not remain, i.e., if there is no blood remaining, he shall not squeeze it out. This indicates that failure to squeeze the blood does not disqualify the offering. And the Gemara answers, there are two Tanaim, and they disagree with regard to the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Right? So what they're disagreeing on seems like when you have a bird sin offering, right? And the priest now is going to actually directly apply the blood from the bird onto the sides of the altar, right? That's the sprinkling of the blood in the case of a sin offering in the form of a bird offering. And then if there's any blood left in that bird, he's going to squeeze that out on the base of the altar. And they're saying, well, what if there's no blood left in the bird? So then has he effected atonement? Or because he ran out of blood before he could put some on the base, you've now disqualified the offering and you have to do it all over again? That's what they're asking. We are on page 52b. Right. So the Gemara continues its discussion of the remainder of the blood. Rami Bar Chama says, this following Tana holds that failure to pour the remainder of the blood of offerings whose blood is sprinkled inside the sanctuary disqualifies the offering. Right? That's not the law. We know that once the sprinklings are done inside the sanctuary, whether for the Yom Kippur offerings or these other offerings that are sprinkled inside, communal error based on the Sanhedrin or error of an anointed priest, etc. Once the sprinklings are done inside the sanctuary, then the remaining blood has to be poured out on the base of the external altar. But if that remainder of the blood is not poured out on the external altar, the offering is nevertheless qualified. It does not become disqualified by the failure to pour out the remaining blood on the base of the external altar. This opinion disagrees with that. This is a minority view. Right? Rami Bar Chama is talking about this minority view held by another Tana, right? By a rabbi of the Mishnaic period. That's what a Tana is, as opposed to an Amora, which is a rabbi from a later period, the period of the Gemara, which is a commentary on the earlier Mishnah. So Rami Bar Chama says, this following Tana holds that failure to pour the remainder of the blood of offerings whose blood is sprinkled inside the sanctuary disqualifies the offering. As it is taught in a baraisa, the priest that sacrifices it for sin shall eat it. Leviticus 6:19. And this verse states the word it to teach that it, the offering whose blood was sprinkled correctly above the red line of the altar, is valid and the priest may eat the meat. But this is not so for an offering whose blood was sprinkled below the red line, which would be disqualified. Okay, sprinkling above or below the red line depends on which kind of offering we're talking about. But when we talk about the red line, we're talking about sprinkling, not pouring out the remainder. So let's keep reading. The Brisa continues, you said this, but from where did you come? In other words, why would one think that such an offering is valid so that the verse needs to teach that it is not? The Brisa explains, from the fact that it is stated, quote, and you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, upon the altar of the Lord your God, and the blood of your offerings shall be poured out against the altar of the Lord your God, and you shall eat the flesh. In Deuteronomy 12:27, from this we learn that with regard to those offerings whose blood is placed with 4 placements on the corners of the altar, that if the priest placed them with only 1 placement, he has effected atonement. Right? We learned that earlier on page 36. Therefore, since it is derived that if the priest does not present the blood on the specified corners of the altar, the offering is nevertheless valid, one might have thought that blood that should have been placed above the red line, but was in fact placed below the red line, would nevertheless effect atonement as well, and the offering is valid. The Brisa continues, and it would seem there is a logical inference to counter this logic. It is stated that blood is to be sprinkled above the red line, referring to the blood of an animal sin offering, which is to be sprinkled on the corners of the upper half of the altar, right? So like on the corners or on the horns of the altar, that's above the red line. Just sprinkling, on the sides of the altar, that's below the red line. That's what the red line is all about. It is stated that blood is to be sprinkled above the red line, referring to the blood of an animal sin offering, which is to be sprinkled on the corners on the upper half of the altar. And it is stated that blood is to be sprinkled below the red line. This is referring to the blood of a bird sin offering, which is to be sprinkled on the lower half of the altar. So just as with regard to the blood about which it is stated that it is to be below the red line, if it is a case where one placed it above the red line, it does not effect atonement, as the sages derived from the verse, and he shall sprinkle of the blood of the sin offering upon the side of the altar, and the remainder of the blood shall be squeezed out at the base of the altar. It is a sin offering. It is a bird sin offering. And that's why it goes below the red line, because it says on the side rather than on the corners. So too, with regard to the blood about which it is stated that it is to be placed above the red line, animal sin offerings, if it is a case where one placed it below the red line, it does not affect atonement because you didn't follow the instructions to do the sprinkling correctly, and the sprinkling is the most important part of bringing an offering. This logical inference, however, can be rejected. No. If you said that this is the law with regard to the blood of a bird sin offering, which is to be sprinkled below the red line, that was placed with a placement above the red line, that may be because they will not ultimately be sprinkled above. And for this reason, it does not affect atonement. But shall you also say that this is the law with regard to the blood that was intended to be sprinkled above the red line, i.e. the blood of an animal sin offering, but which one ended up placing below the red line, that it will not affect atonement? Why should you assume that? The blood that is to be sprinkled above the red line is different, as some of it is sacrificed below the red line when the remainder of the blood is poured on the base of the altar, right? The blood of animal sin offerings ends up being both above and below the red line, on top where the sprinkling happens, and below where the remainder of the blood is poured on the base. Since the blood of animal sin offerings is destined to appear on the altar both above and below the red line, maybe it's going to have a different outcome for getting it wrong than a bird sin offering, the blood of which is always destined to remain below the red line, right? On the sides of the altar where it's sprinkled, and then whatever the remainder is squeezed out on the base. And the Baraisa responds to this challenge by saying, the blood that is placed inside the sanctuary will prove it, as some of it is sacrificed outside. But if the priest initially placed the blood on the altar outside the sanctuary, it does not affect atonement. But the Baraisa rejects this challenge by saying, no, if you said that this is the law with regard to the blood that is placed inside the sanctuary, concerning which the inner altar does not complete the atonement, as they require additional blood placements, shall you also say that this is the law with regard to the blood offered above the red line, i.e. the blood of an animal sin offering that is offered only on the external altar, concerning which the corners of the altar complete the atonement? Accordingly, it is possible to say that if one placed them below the red line, they are valid. Right? Sprinklings that are done inside the sanctuary, some of it is sprinkled on the incense altar. Some of it is sprinkled on the curtain that separates between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. Right? So the altar, sprinkling on the inner altar doesn't complete the atonement, as opposed to regular sin offering animals that are sprinkled outside on the external altar. Once you sprinkle, right, above the red line, one sprinkling, in fact, will do it. The atonement is completed. That's different than sprinklings that happen inside the sanctuary, where all of them are necessary. And all of them have to be done right. So to counter this reasoning, the verse states with regard to an animal sin offering that is sacrificed outside, the priest that sacrifices it for sin shall eat it, in Leviticus 6:19. And this emphasizes that it, the offering whose blood was placed correctly above the red line of the altar, is valid, and the priest may then eat that meat. But this is not so for an offering whose blood was placed below the red line, which is disqualified, and therefore the priest cannot eat from that sin offering. And now Rabbi Bar Chama proves his point. What does the Baraisa mean when it says, if you said that this is the law with regard to the blood that is placed inside the sanctuary, concerning which the inner altar does not complete the atonement, what is required to complete the atonement? Is it not referring to this remainder of the blood? And is teaching that failure to pour the remainder of the blood on the base of the altar disqualifies the offering. Minority view. And Rav has said to Rami Bar Chama, if so, that the Tana that you're quoting in that Baraisa holds that failure to pour the remainder of the blood of the offerings whose blood is sprinkled inside the sanctuary would disqualify the offering, right? If you don't pour the remainder outside on the base, you could derive the law that if the priest sprinkled the blood below the red line, the offering is disqualified via a kal vachomer inference, right? If that logic works, then this logic would work. It's not, and that's why it's going to be used as a disproof. But the kal vachomer that he's using for his disproof is like this: just as it is with regard to the remainder of the blood of the offerings of the inner altar, concerning which their ultimate ritual pouring on the base of the outer altar is obligatory to be done on the external altar, outer altar. But if the priest initially performed the rite of placing the blood on the external altar, it does not affect atonement. Then, with regard to those offerings whose blood is placed above the red line, concerning which their ultimate rite pouring on the base of the altar is not obligatory below the red line of the altar, and the priest initially performed the rite of placing the blood below the red line, is it not logical that it does not affect atonement? Since the Baraisa does not advance this claim, but rather derive the law from a verse, this indicates that pouring the remainder of the blood on the base is not obligatory. Rava continues his proof. His disproof. So rather, when the Baraisa states that the blood of the offerings offered inside the sanctuary are those concerning which the inner altar does not complete the atonement, it means that the inner altar does not complete the atonement alone, but rather requires that blood also be sprinkled inside the sanctuary on the curtain, separating the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. That's what it means, that it doesn't complete just sprinkling on the inner altar, not that you also, at the end of the day, after all the inner sprinklings inside the sanctuary have been completed and completed properly, that you are obliged, in order to effect atonement, to pour the remainder of that base on the external altar. That is what you're supposed to do, but if the remainder doesn't reach the base of the external altar, the atonement was effected nonetheless. Okay, new topic, and I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The sages taught in a Baraisa, the verse states concerning the sacrificial rite performed by the high priest on Yom Kippur, and when he has finished atoning for the sanctuary and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat. Leviticus 16:20. This verse indicates that if he performed the atonement, he has finished the service. But if he did not perform the atonement, he has not finished. This is the statement of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yehuda said to him, for what reason do we not say, if he finished, he has performed atonement, but if he did not finish, he has not performed atonement? This derivation would indicate that if any of the blood placements is lacking, it is as though he did nothing. So now the Gemara clarifies the two opinions. What is the difference between them? Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi engage in a dispute concerning this. One of them says that interpretation of the meaning of the verse is the difference between them, i.e. there is no halachic difference between them, but only a dispute as to how we get there. And one says, right, they're talking about what is the difference between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda. They're going to agree on what the law is, but they're going to get there a different way. That's one view. The other view is that there is a difference between them with regard to whether failure to pour the remainder of the base of the blood on the base of the altar disqualifies the offering or not. They don't come out in the same place. According to Rabbi Akiva, it does not disqualify the offering, whereas Rabbi Yehuda maintains that it does disqualify the offering. Right? So there are two different views on what is the disagreement between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda. One view is the law is the same for both of them, they just get there a different way. The other view is, no, they disagree on this matter of, if you fail to pour the remainder of the blood out on the base of the external altar, have you affected the atonement of Yom Kippur or not? So, the Gemara suggests, it may be concluded that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is the one who says that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda disagree as to whether or not failure to pour the remainder of the blood on the altar disqualifies the offering. How do we know that? As Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, according to the statement of the one who says that failure to pour the remainder of the blood on the base of the altar disqualifies the offering, if the priest finished placing the blood on the inner altar and the blood was spilled before he poured the remainder on the external altar, he must bring one bull and slaughter it and begin the sprinkling of the blood as he did initially on the inner altar, so that there will be blood remaining from the sprinkling, and then he pours the remainder of the blood on the external altar, right? So the remainder of after he does all this on Yom Kippur, the high priest does all these sprinklings inside the sanctuary, inside the Holy of Holies, etc. He has a remainder of blood, and then he has to come, when he leaves the sanctuary, he pours that out on the base of the external altar. If he dropped the service vessel before he poured out the remainder on the external altar, has he affected atonement or not? One view would be, yes, he already did all the sprinklings. He's not able to dispose of the blood in the correct way by pouring it out on the altar, but he has effected atonement. The other view is, no, he has to have that remaining blood to pour out on the external altar. If he spills it, even though he did all the sprinklings correctly, if he spills it before he pours it out on the external base, he's going to have to slaughter another bull, I guess sprinkle all over again, so that he now has remaining blood that he can pour on the external altar. So according to that view, it would seem that he has to have blood to sprinkle on the external altar so that he can complete the atonement of Yom Kippur. So therefore, it must be that pouring out on the base is obligatory, is essential to achieving the atonement of Yom Kippur, according to this view. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi discusses the opinion that failure to pour the remainder of the blood on the base of the altar disqualifies the offering, apparently in reference to the Baraisa that we are talking about here. The Gemara asks, is that to say that Rabbi Yochanan does not agree with this reasoning? But doesn't Rabbi Yochanan himself say, on page 111a of this tractate, that Rabbi Nehemiah taught a law in accordance with the statement of the one who says that failure to pour the remainder of the blood disqualifies the offering? Rabbi Yochanan also discusses the opinion of a Tana who holds that failure to pour the remainder of the blood disqualifies the offering, apparently in reference to the Baraisa we're talking about here. Rather, there is no proof that Rabbi Yochanan is referring to the dispute between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda. He might have arrived at that conclusion through a different route. He is stating a law in accordance with the statement of the one who says that it disqualifies the offering no matter what Tana may be saying it, but he is not referring to the dispute between these Tanaim, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda. Here too, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is stating a law in accordance with the statement of the one who says that it disqualifies the offering, whoever that Tana may be, but he is not referring to this dispute between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda. And that's where we finish our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 5. We'll pick it up tomorrow with Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 5. I'm only seeing one question from Joseph. Are the hermeneutical rules, presumably of Rabbi Yishmael, derived from a tradition or from logical means, perhaps both, the Bible itself? Okay, so these types of rules by which we can learn out laws that are not stated explicitly in the Torah, like a kal vachomer, like a binyan, like a gezeirah shavah, right? So these kinds of rules that enable us to link one verse to another and learn out a law from one verse where it's stated explicitly to another verse where it's not. Where do we get these rules is what Yosef is asking. And the answer is yes. It's learned both ways. There are different listings of those rules. The most famous is the list of Rabbi Yishmael, his 13 principles of hermeneutics. And we say that every day in the prayer book. But there are other lists, right, with different numbers of these rules. You mentioned that there's one of Hillel also, and there's other sages. But where did they get these rules? Answer, some of them were given at Mount Sinai, right, to Moses, and were transmitted ever since. Others were developed later, and I don't know exactly, the path and the origin of each of these hermeneutical laws. But I will say that it's both a tradition that goes all the way back to Mount Sinai, and some of these rules were sort of derived from the rules that were given at Mount Sinai later by the sages, rules by which we can derive laws, is what you're talking about. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.